Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know by now, because we're in our 25th anniversary season, I interview poets and other writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they might be planning for the future. We have on poets, we have on historians, we have memoirists, we have editors, short story writers, all kinds of writers. We even extend to some other brands of artists. We've had on musicians, actors, sculptors. It's a pretty wide net. So if you have an idea for someone who might be a good guest for the Writer's Block, writer or other form of artist, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to mention that the Writer's Block and all of the other original programming that comes out of Cape Ann TV is a product of cable access television. You don't get that with Dish, so don't be tempted to switch. I'm very happy to say tonight we do have a writer, a historian, memoirist from Rockport by the name of Sarah Clark, and she has written a very, very interesting personal memoir of her growing up in Rockport, one of our catchment area towns, during the 1950s and 60s. A Rockport childhood. And we'll be talking about that during the next half hour. Welcome to the Writer's Block, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming down.
It's good to be here.
There's an interesting passage early in the book when you said you started thinking about writing this because you were challenged that your memories of growing up in Rockport were too perfect. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, I was a Unitarian Universalist minister for about 10 years, and before I became a minister, you have to go through all these testing. And one of the psychological tests was writing about your childhood, and when I went in to review it with the psychologist, he accused me of being too idyllic. When I wrote about my childhood, it couldn't have been that good. And I said to him, well, I grew up in Rockport. And that had he just didn't have any response to that. Apparently, he's one of the few people in the world who hasn't heard of Rockport. Right. And so that got me thinking, I had plenty of other things that were sad in my life that I had put into my history. So it wasn't that I was just a Pollyanna. Then when I got back to Rockport recently and been on the internet, there's a whole group of, if you grew up in Rockport when, and there's another group on Rockport stuff, and all those people seem to have a great affection for Rockport and feel they had a very good time growing up there. And so I thought, I'm not alone. And that's the book.
That interested me too from another angle. When you were studying to be in the ministry, you were a middle-aged woman,
yes,
and not
right.
as
No,
you say, Pollyanna, it's not 20 or 25
yeah.
thinking the whole world
right.
is rosy. So even from that distance, it seemed pretty good to you?
Well, I think especially from that distance, as it had so much else happen in my life that wasn't rosy at all. That's why, and that I had recorded. So and also, as I say in the book, I had met people who had had terrible childhoods, who really had been abused by their fathers and all of that. Yes, and when you hear about that, how can you complain about, growing up in Rockport with a really nice mother and father? I mean, sure, you had fights with them sometimes, but, nothing that isn't on Father Knows Best.
Yes, you do mention some really harsh backgrounds that you'd heard of from other people. And
everything's relative in life.
Yes. So having to walk 3 blocks to get a loaf of bread is not a hard
No.
You just mentioned your mother and father, Marion and James, who are the 2 of the central people in there.
Yes.
Well, they are the central people in there, if not yourself.
In your childhood, usually that's the case. And
can you describe, before we get to them specifically, the layout of the book? And the general chapter structure?
Well, I think it's kind of a ramble because I kind of start someplace and go another place. I noticed recently as I was looking it over, I hardly mentioned childhood summers, which I suppose I should go back and write about. But I do start with the idea that you have to know about your mother and father and how they met and how they grew up to then go on to yourself. We none of us just start with we're products of our mothers and fathers and our families, and so that the family is very important.
I know there is a temptation when you're a child to think, well, your parents just were automatically
there.
parents. They were born parents, and the structure was set from eternity.
Yeah.
Although this gets around that, or gets beyond that. You close, in fact, with some love letters.
Right, I do. And my mother and father, I mean, my father was always talking, about how they met, and my father was always, as I say, once a week at least, he told how my mother had changed his life, because he'd had a tough life growing up. And,
sounds like that comedy series, How I Met Your Mother.
Yes, so that was all in there. And
can you enlarge a little bit about that, specifically about your mother's character and background, Marion?
Yeah.
Marion Dodge. Her maiden name's Dodge.
Right, and she came from an old Rockport family, Dodges, Gotts, all the way back, and they had lived in a big house on Pleasant Corners in Rockport, the corner of Mount Pleasant and Pleasant, for 150 years. The house had been in the family, but she had to sell it eventually, and they had to move out first during the Depression and rent it, and she moved into this house next to the post office in Rockport, the Iron Balcony, which was run by a Swedish lady. She had a boarding house, and so she moved in there with my grandmother, because my grandfather had died. And my father was a Gloucester boy. He was always the Gloucester boy who married Marion Dodge, even after 40 years.
Gloucester boy.
So
such a far-flung person.
Exactly. It's so he just came. She worked. She became town clerk. She was the first woman town clerk in Rockport, and only the third in the state. And he came over to. He was on the newspaper, and she did the Rockport news for the Gloucester Times, but she couldn't do the town meeting because she had to do it for the town. So he was sent over. And there, as I say in my book, he said he had a hard time concentrating because of this luscious redhead with her beautiful legs. And they started to date after that. But it was a difficult time because my grandmother was so afraid she'd be left alone that she started having these palpitations, and so
she wasn't against. I think you said she wasn't against love.
No,
she just was worried about her future during a very difficult time.
Yeah.
So, your mother's from Rockport, your father's from Gloucester, and your mother won the geographical discussion.
Yes.
He migrated
to Rockport.
He migrated to Rockport. He became a Rockport.
He became a Rockport. He was going to spend his life at the Gloucester YMCA. They used to rent rooms, but she finally won him over, and they both set up housekeeping in Rockport.
I want to talk more about the book, but before I do, I think our viewers are always interested in how a writer got the idea, how you sat down and made yourself do it, how long it took, and when did the book come out? There's 5 questions in there.
Yeah,
so.
It came out last year, and I had written it a year before, and then I had sort of let it sit for a year, and then went through and edited it and had a friend read it, and she gave me some suggestions and helped out. But also, mostly she encouraged me to get it published.
And who was that?
My friend Kasha.
Who happens to be in the audience
here,
tonight.
yes. And she's just every writer needs someone who encourages them, because there's enough people out there who'll say, no one's interested in that, So you need someone who reads the book and says, that's great, print it. And I decided to print it myself because I had come to the point where I've been working at the Sandy Bay Historical in Rockport, and I put on an exhibition a year ago of our vintage costumes. We had clothes. We had found all these clothes in our attic, and as we put them together, we kept saying, there's no story. These beautiful clothes, and we don't know. We know sometimes a name, but often not even a name. And you wanted to know the story of the people who wore these clothes. And I realized how little of my own family's story I know. And so I wanted to leave something for my great-great-grandchildren So they would know the story of growing up in Rockport in this particular time. And I had a diary once from my great-grandmother, but all she put in it was cloudy, rain, I mean, didn't tell anything about their life. So that was my inspiration to do it. I trained as a writer, so I've been writing
your
off and on all
academic
my life.
background was
Yeah.
writing?
I went to the Yale Drama School in playwriting, so I did a lot of playwriting at one point.
Well, there's a lot of drama in this
Yes.
book. Where can our viewers buy this? I
They
want
can
to
get
make
it-
sure I don't forget them.
Toad Hall and the bookstore in Gloucester. Toad Hall in Rockport and the bookstore in
Can they buy it online
Gloucester.
as well?
No, they can't get this book online.
But at 2 bookstores here on Cape
Yeah.
Ann. I'm going to hold it up again, see if I can hold it up so that there's no reflection. Does that show up well, Ryan? Okay, good. Could you pick out a passage to read a section, a section from that
Sure.
sort of captures the tone and some of your goals and style and circumstance?
This chapter is called The Joys of Snowstorms.
You know, what page are you on?
It's on 88. Once into January, winter locked us in her chill white arms, with the only hope being the promised January thaw, melting the snow briefly. But we knew quite well the thaw was flirting with us, clearing off the sidewalks in preparation for the big sea-blowing blizzards. I loved to wake in the night to the roar and rattle of the wind, the stinging sound of snow pelting our windows, the frost lace on their panes reflected in the glow of the street lamps. The best sound of all was the rumble of the snowplow, like a friendly dinosaur announcing his presence. My brother and I pressed our noses against the cold glass and cheered as the plow's headlights revealed the huge drifts. No school, we yipped, and snuggled down in our beds with dreams of snowmen in our heads. It seems that the years of my childhood were years of great snows, whether in truth or not. Some years we constructed a snow tunnel in our backyard, pretending to be Eskimos. Every year my girlfriends and I created flocks of snow angels. Snowballs flew through the air, glimmering in the brilliant sun and blue sky of the day after a storm. We delighted in tumbling, rolling, somersaulting over, through, and into the snow. The radiators steamed with soggy mittens, hats, and mufflers. Boots dripped onto newspapers over the mats in the hall. Sipping cocoa with marshmallow before the crackling fire between snow excursions, I watched fascinated as my father and brother played chess or cribbage. My mother set us loose in the kitchen to make fudge, setting it in the snow on the back steps to cool. As February arrived, I trekked over to Mrs. Savage's penny candy shop to buy valentines. My heart flooded delightedly at the choices spread under the curved glass case.
A little hope for spring there.
Yes.
Valentine's Day. Very nicely done, and I think you've got a good diction, a good choice of words, and I like even a couple of rhymes sneak in there. Snuggle down in our beds with dreams of snowmen in our heads. Very nicely done. I think that evoked for me immediately our last winter here
Yes.
of 13, 14. My toes were cold until May, I think. Your mother and father are the main characters, Marion and James.
Or Jimmy.
Jimmy.
I'm Jimmy Clark, he would tell
Jimmy?
you. I'm not James.
Jimmy Clark. But there are other personalities in
Yeah.
there, not to say characters.
Oh, yes.
And I'd like to ask you about a couple of those. You had an aunt by the name of Ada.
Yeah.
She was your mother's
Sister, yes.
older sister,
Younger sister.
younger
There's
sister.
10 years between them.
And who was married to Uncle Milton.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about Aunt Ada and Uncle Milton?
Well, Ada was a bit, as I say in the book, irascible. She was apt to fly into a temper at different things. So you always had to watch yourself with Ada. Milton was much more calm. They both grew up here, but Milton was very tall and very handsome. He looked like Ernest Hemingway. Ada was like myself, very small. All my mother and all her sisters and brothers, they were all redheads, despite the fact that neither parent was until my grandfather grew a beard. Turned out there was red hair in the family. So she was the one definitely with a redhead temper. But she was also an artist, so she did in fact, the painting that's on the cover is a painting of the garden at the home that they had at the house at Pleasant Corners.
From 1920, I think the date was.
Yeah, because they left it, and so I assume she did it from memory, as artists do. My grandfather, I guess, was a very good gardener. I wish I had inherited his skill.
You said that, if I remember right, sometimes if the right guests were at dinner, Ada's temper would be controlled.
Yes, well, that is something everyone knows, that if a family has guests from outside the family, then the family will be better behaved. But when it's just family, then they kind of let go. And so my mother would invite Dr. Cleaves or somebody, someone else. But some years she didn't get anybody else, and Ada just flew off the handle. And usually at my father, who she just considered was not quite good enough. She never had quite accepted him. But it didn't bother him at all. He just said, "Oh, that's Ada."
Is that because he was from Gloucester? Or?
Well, he's from Gloucester, and he's from a poor family. He earned his way through Yale. He got a scholarship to Yale, Sheffield Scientific, and earned his way through by waiting on tables. And as I say in the book, he washed dishes in a Spanish restaurant, so he got the Spanish prize at Yale because he had total immersion in Spanish and did very well in it. But that wasn't good enough for Ada. The strange thing is that years and years later, my niece did genealogy, and she found out that both my father and my mother had a common ancestor who was a Dodge.
Really?
Yes.
So they are.
So actually, he had as good a background as she did.
So they were third or fourth or fifth cousins.
It would be many cousins.
Did that quiet Ada down a little?
Well, no, my father never knew it either. He always thought he was just the boy from the other side of the tracks in Gloucester.
How about your uncle Milton? Was he a steady? You said he was tall and handsome.
Yes.
Looked like Hemingway.
Yes.
He was not too much of a steadying force on Ada.
He was. I mean, she did what he said, really, in the end. As I say, it was rather sad because she wanted to have children and he didn't. So they didn't have children, which is a very sad thing.
I wonder if that was the source of her.
Well, my mother
irascibility.
thought it could be. If you have to leave something that you really want that you don't get, that's hard. But they also lived in Concord, and they worked at Harvard, and so they were a step above us.
Can you think of another passage that you might read that reflects something about Rockport or some of the individuals in your family that you focused on through the book?
Well, I know you had mentioned, I had talked about Miss Jellicoe's class.
Yes.
And in the beginning I was just talking about what fun it was because she loved Santa Clauses and had all these Santa Clauses up. And then I said she got ill and was away, and we had a substitute who we made miserable, as is the case with most substitutes in children. And at some point I mentioned it to my mother. And I said, what I mentioned was that I said to my father, what does it mean when the kids call the substitute a pinko? That was the latest whispering campaign in class. I realized she was a shaky teacher, but what had that to do with her color, which in fact looked ashen white to me, a color for which I was partially responsible. My father's eyes sharpened at the word. Where did you hear that? It's what the kids are saying. "That's terrible, poor woman," my mother spoke up. "What are you kids doing to her?" Faced with the full attention of my parents, the story of our substitute's trials was soon extracted from me. My father was grim. He was on the school committee. There apparently had been some complaints about the political affiliations of our teacher. This was the time of the McCarthy hearings. "Your teacher is not a pinko. It's just a few narrow-minded people who suspect anyone who's different. Don't you use that word. Miss Jollick will be back next week. In the meantime, I think your class owes the substitute an apology." And I went on to say they didn't force me to make that happen, but I did. I was asked to go and apologize to her at her home, and we brought her a present. So
That interested me because often as a child, if you're living in a happy family, the trials and tribulations of the broader country aren't so visible. I have no really active memories of McCarthyism, although we're about the same age. I knew that was through that era. And people talk about the good old days of the Second World War.
Yeah.
Well,
because my father was a newspaper reporter, so we heard everything. At the dinner table, we'd come in, and he'd tell us everything that had happened in Gloucester. And, of course, everything that happened, I mean, we'd have a phone call that a boat had gone down, and my father would have to call the family. And I'd say to him, "How can you do that? You know, they've just lost their husbands and sons." And he'd say, "Well, they want their names in the paper, and they want them in right. And this is the last thing they're going to have to remember them is this story I write." And so that's important.
And that still goes on.
Yeah. And he was noted for knowing all the various spellings of the Shimataros in town.
That's a feat.
They included that in his obituary. So we knew a lot more about what was going on, I think. And he loved to have us argue at the dinner table, and he loved to take the other side, whatever it was, to get us thinking. So, but obviously, I mean, I was only in fourth grade. I hadn't really heard about the McCarthy hearings. That must have gone over my head until he said this.
Yeah. I want to ask a couple technical questions. You said you brought the book out yourself, and I just got the 5 minutes on, so I want to make sure I work this in. What process did you use to bring the book out?
Well, I just, actually it was Wendy Fitting has had a book published by the Universalist Church, Unitarian Universalist Church.
Just recently retired.
Just recently retired. And I liked the way it looked,
here.
so I asked them who had published it and or printed it. And they gave me the printer's name in Portland, and I got in contact with them, and I just had to, prepare it, the text, camera ready, basically. And that's what I did.
So very simple, direct.
Very simple,
Portland,
yeah.
Maine.
And I did get someone to help me put together the cover. I paid somebody to do that.
It's a very handsome book.
Yes,
and
I thought
think
so.
that the oil painting, which you used for a cover shot from one of your the relatives who was a star in the book, is a very good choice.
Yeah. And it's idyllic looking, isn't it?
It is. It is very idyllic looking. Yes, you couldn't possibly be that good. We're going to get another time warning here for a second. I wanted to mention again that you close with some love letters from
my dad
Jimmy
to my mother.
to your mom, Marion. Can you read just a paragraph of one of those to give a feel for the affection that they shared early on?
Let's see. Marion, dear. Perhaps I too have been so used to being booted around by people that I never really expected to have any person whom I cared greatly for actually worry whether or not I buttoned my coat on the port or the starboard quarter. Liking you is nothing new with me, Marion. I can truthfully say that it started when you and I crashed in on that special town meeting to decide the fate of the principal. First off, I thought you were well-formed physically. Next, your beautiful sunset-splashed hair made your lips all the more kissable. Then I liked you, for I had talked with you, and your patter soothed a deep hurt within me.
It's very touching and affectionate and warm, but not racy.
Right?
Was it a shock when you first read these letters to see, oh, your parents are so human and so...
No, because as I say, my dad they were always very open about loving each other. And my mother missed him every year after he died. He He had a hemorrhage at the, he died on the dock, actually, outside the Gloucester House. He was at a Democratic meeting, went out for air, and just died there.
And how old was he?
64.
60, even by standards then,
Yeah.
quite a young man.
Yeah.
I want to show another book you brought down by your dad, Jimmy, although it says Jim here,
Yeah.
which you edited,
Yeah.
called The Wife and I, Walks in the Woods and Lanes of Cape Ann in 1958-59.
He wrote a column for the newspaper that was in, 2 or 3 times a month about a walk in a different part of Rockport. And also in this one, he went to Sylvester Ahola's and had a wonderful time over there, so that's in there too.
And that's, I'm sure, if anybody wants to look
Yes,
at that, the
same place.
library has it? Or?
No, well, the bookstores,
Oh, the
both
bookstores have
bookstores have it.
that. Okay, good.
You can get it at the library, but go to the bookstore.
Yes, go to the bookstore, buy it. It's reasonably priced.
Yeah.
I think I got the 2-minute signal. Did I get the 2-minute signal? I did. I'm going to have to begin to close. Sarah Clark, I want to thank you very much for coming down and talking about a Rockport childhood.
Thank you.
I want to thank our audience in Cablecast land as well for being with us this evening on the Writer's Block. If you've learned something about Sarah Clark's background and in Rockport and an idyllic childhood there back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.